Okay, so I'm going to talk about my latest book, The Path of the Warrior Mystic, Being a Man in an Age of Chaos. And I'm going to talk about it specifically in regard to Freemasonry and the Masonic initiatic experience. And to briefly go through the book, I'm just going to look at the title itself and the different elements of the title, which of course show up in the book itself, and which you will recognize in your Masonic journey. So the path of the warrior mystic, being a man in an age of chaos. Now, the first word I want to look at is path. And of course, in Freemasonry, we have the initiatic journey and the journey from darkness to light. And now, one of the things that has occurred in our own time, we've become very much more preoccupied with safety and protection and comfort. And certainly when we look back over the millennia, part of the, let's say, function of the male was to go out into the wilderness, into danger, into new horizons, and into the unknown. And if we look at pre-Christian Northern Europe, for example, as well as many other cultures from India, Iran, and Southern Europe as well, probably further abroad, we find that young men in tribal societies were expected to join some kind of band, some kind of Manabund, a male society, Manabund, and were expected to participate in wars, often without weapons, and to prove themselves to be brave. Very often they would live in the wilderness, in the wild. They might have to kill animals for food, often with their bare hands, and were essentially outside of society, in the unknown, in the liminal world, the world of the unknown. And in Freemasonry, of course, the unknown is a very large element. The initiate does not know what he will experience when he enters the lodge. He is blindfolded. Much of it is experienced in darkness, of course. And in regard to the word path, of course, he is led along a certain route, through a certain path, where he will experience different Masonic things for the first time. And again, I would point out that this ritual act of going into the unknown, into the darkness, into the wild, as it were, psychologically, is very much a reflection of what we find in pre-modern and more especially in ancient culture. Now, looking at the warrior and the mystic, which we could say gives substance to the Masonic Lodge, though we may not think of Freemasonry as being directly related to either of these, at least in terms of the craft lodge, entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason. We find both of these are very much present. Of course, outside of the lodge, at the outer door, we have the Tyler with the sword. The sword is used for self-defense, is used for war. It was a weapon of war. And in a sense, then, we already find one of the more significant tools and symbols of the warrior, even before entering the lodge. And, again, we find other warrior aspects within Freemasonry, the sword pointing at the naked breast or the heart, for example, in the tracing boards of Freemasonry, or the dagger, for example. And so you have this element of the warrior, but again, this is tied to what we might call the mystic, as well as to civilization. Now, I use the term mystic in a way that the historian Arnold Toynbee uses it, which has a kind of double meaning. And one is that the spiritual person, the person who receives a kind of revelation, as well as the creator, and both of these individuals are able to transform society, one through a religious revelation and one through the transformation of the arts. And if we look at the Masonic Lodge again, we find that, of course, there are the 7 liberal arts spoken about, especially in the second degree of Freemasonry, where they constitute quite a large section of that degree. And if we combine the 7 liberal arts with the sword, we have, of course, the basic education of the gentleman in Europe prior to the modern age, and perhaps into the modern age. The gentleman would have learned the 7 liberal arts, but he would also have learned wrestling, quite probably, possibly boxing, and most definitely the sword for self-defense. And of course, many men carried a sword stick, which was a kind of walking cane that could be unscrewed, and inside would be a sword that you could use for self-defense. So in a sense, we have the idea of the warrior mystic very much in European culture, with the learning of the liberal arts, but also the learning of self-defense, fighting, and so on. And this is something not exclusive to Europe at all. We find this really across the globe. The samurai Miyamoto Musashi, apart from being a very feared and renowned warrior, was also renowned and still is renowned today for his calligraphy and his painting. During his lifetime, he was also renowned for his landscape gardening. Again, you can find, going back in time, the Viking warrior Egil Skallagrimsson, a very feared warrior, but also one of the most renowned poets of his day, or Plato, who spoke about learning through wrestling, music, and philosophy. And his point about philosophy, music, and wrestling was that wrestling alone would make somebody uncouth and too coarse in their behavior, too aggressive, and learning music alone would make you too soft, too feminine. And so you had to combine the two. Again, in the Masonic Lodge, we have the 7 liberal arts and the sword. And so you see this bringing together of the symbolism of the warrior and the mystic, the warrior and the creator, with 2 sides of man that we should be developing ourselves, each of us. Now, I mentioned the path, and let's also talk about chaos, because chaos and the path, or the path, are very much intertwined. In a sense, the path is a path through chaos. Chaos is the state of the world in its natural condition. Although we don't like to believe that to be the case today, and we believe that more and more rules will create more and more safety, when actually it's probably very much the opposite that will occur eventually. If you look at the positive thinking movement, which is also called the New Thought movement, or at least that was an earlier name for it, or sometimes mind metaphysics, they believe that by visualizing, by believing and emotionally investing an idea of how the future can be, that you can transform the environment or transform yourself to create the life that you desire. So if you desire wealth, you can visualize yourself as being wealthy and invest that with emotional energy and believe it to be so, and that it will occur. Now, I think there are some very real criticisms that one can make of the positive thinking or New Thought movement, but the idea itself, when you boil it down, is in a sense that everything is chaos, because in a world where there can be creativity, potential, where we can do new things or create new and interesting things, you need this chaos, this world of absolute potential. And of course, in all of our lives, we experience coincidences, good fortune, sometimes bad fortune. Sometimes that bad fortune turns out months or years later to be good fortune because we do something better instead. But we need this kind of this world of potential and change and flux and chaos to create something out of it. And Freemasonry, in a sense, the initiatic journey is a journey symbolically through chaos. In alchemy, chaos is this sort of absolute potential, the beginning substance through which the gold can eventually be cultivated. In Freemasonry, of course, we have the rough ashlar, and although it may not be put in those terms, we could say that the rough ashlar is the symbol of chaos, the symbol of formlessness, out of which we can form the perfect ashlar, the perfect man. And you have that saying in the Scottish Rite Ordo ad Chaos, out of chaos comes order, or order out of chaos. And again, the rough ashlar would symbolize or signify chaos, and out of that we can create the perfect ashlar. And of course, as we know, the rough and perfect ashlar are not to be taken literally, just as no symbol is to be taken literally. It really refers, in this case, to the individual himself, the rough man, the raw material for creating a better human being, a better man, and then the perfect ashlar being the perfect man, or at least the individual who has refined himself in certain respects to become a better person, a better man, through the application of Masonic principles, symbolized or signified, for example, by the trowel, or by the square and compasses, or the plumb, or the rule, and so on. We can think, for example, the 24-inch gauge. So applying the 24-inch gauge to our life, dividing the day into 3 for work, rest, and time to devote to spiritual or metaphysical ideas, or the plumb, the idea of being upright, not only upright morally, although that's the most literal interpretation, but I would say upright in terms of our posture, which affects our sense of being, and can affect our consciousness, our state of mind, which affects our behavior. So out of chaos, out of the rough ashlar, we create the perfect ashlar, the perfect man, or at least the perfect individual, as he has refined himself in accordance with his own nature, let's say, in accordance with his own inclinations. We don't want to turn everybody into a carbon copy, but we do want, for example, the man who has the potential to be a great warrior to become a great warrior, the man who has the potential to become a great artist to become a great artist, the man who has the potential to become a great intellectual to become a great intellectual, to move from the rough ashlar to the perfect ashlar, from chaos to man, in the full sense of the word. Now, I'm going to read a passage from the Old English rune poem, and I should be said that this is a translation by me, which I made around 15 years ago, published in the Journal of Indo-European Studies, but I think it will help us to understand a little more. And the Old English poem reads, "Man in his mirth is beloved by his kindred, though shall everyone far depart, for by his decree the Lord determines that the pitiful flesh is given to the earth." And so man in his mirth, or man in his joy, is dear to other men. We can see this as a very fraternal idea. There's a fraternal love, brotherly love, the society of men, the Männerbund, which I mentioned at the beginning, the male society. There's a strong bond between men who encourage each other to develop from the rough ashlar to the perfect ashlar, by going into the unknown, by in a sense taking risk, manageable risks, going into the unknown, into the wild, confronting the unknown and developing oneself in the face of challenges, which are symbolically represented through the Masonic initiation, the confrontation symbolically with death or mortality, for example. And again, in the Old English rune poem, as I just read, there is this mention that the flesh departs, the human being, the man departs through the decree of the Lord being God. And again, in Freemasonry, this idea of mortality. And mortality as well is part of this chaos, that things are always in change, even life itself turning eventually into death. And what can we make of our lives in this time in which we must, for one reason or another, live in a state of chaos, in a state of potential? And this, I think, is the question that probably all members of the fraternity or Manabund, and really maybe anyone who wants to live a decent life should reflect upon. So just to recap, I spoke about the path, the warrior or warrior mystic, chaos, and man. And again, the idea that we see in Freemasonry, in ancient societies going back before Christianity, and really around the globe, we have this idea that the man enters into the wilderness, the path through chaos, the path into the unknown, to face these challenges. And again, we find this very much reflected in the Masonic initiation today. A society, of course, that goes back 600 years at least, if you look at the different old charges or manuscripts from Great Britain. Certainly the oldest such society in the world, where we have this idea, this ritual, this initiation going into the wild, very much reflective of ancient cultures around the globe, going into this chaos and molding ourselves through this confrontation with the unknown, with mortality. And in a sense, in that environment, transforming ourselves into the warrior mystic, the man, the sword who knows the liberal arts, the man who is prepared to defend himself, who is able to become strong or fierce, but is also cultured and refined, and an intellect as well as a body. And out of this process, out of the initiatic process, through the Manabund, the male society, arises the man. So instead of chaos, instead of the rough ashlar, instead of the raw material, the unrefined individual, the person who hasn't developed a personality, who hasn't developed a person in himself, really. Instead of that, instead of the chaos, the rough ashlar, we create the perfect ashlar. We create ourselves as our own potential allows. The potential artist becoming the great artist, the potential warrior becoming the great warrior. Out of chaos, out of the initiatic tradition, out of initiation, going into the unknown, of developing these different sides, these opposite sides, the warrior and the mystic, we arise as a man in the full sense of the word, the initiated man, the perfect ashlar.